I was wondering if you could tell us, your name, and then in just a couple of sentences, explain to the general public visitor about your expertise and interest in artificial intelligence and today's large language models, chatbots, and also policy around them.
Hi, I'm Gary Marcus. I have been working on natural and artificial intelligence my whole career. My PhD was on comparing neural networks in children and how they learn language. Basically, my entire career, I've asked questions about generalization. If you get some data, what do you learn from those data? This has led me to a lot of different questions, like do chatbots understand anything about language? Will they ever understand anything about language? What kinds of policies do we want in the world as we develop chatbots that maybe don't perfectly understand language and turn out to make up things that some of us call hallucinations? So I have focused on children, machines, and policy.
Great, thank you. Um, so now I'll just get into some of the substantive questions. And the first one I'd like to ask you is that some experts say that today's chatbots are stochastic parrots that only give the appearance of understanding things, while there are other experts that say that these systems are actually emergent learners that actually do understand things about the world. Which do you think it is?
I think anybody who's really seriously investigated the problem understands that these systems do not understand language. Or you can kind of downscale your terminology. You can say your thermostat understands the temperature. I mean, people can always play games with the meanings of words, but when humans understand language, they build mental models of the world, what other people are saying, what their intentions are, what the objects are. If you watch a movie, you learn about the characters and maybe the vehicles that they drive or the spaceships that they're flying around. You build a model in your head of what's going on in the world, and language is all about relating to that model. And these machines don't do that. And that's why, for example, they make stuff up a lot. They don't know what's true. They don't have a model of the world. They just have a model of what people say in different circumstances. So they're closer to the autocomplete in your phone than your 3-year-old who's actually building a model of the world.
Thank you. Um, there are many issues about trust surrounding chatbots, and I'd like to ask you about some of those issues. And so, first, could you help the general public visitor understand the issue of explainability with regard to large language models and chatbots based on them?
One of the deepest challenges related to current technology is that things like large language models are what we call black boxes. What that means is we give them some training data, a lot of training data, like the whole internet, and we give them what people call input prompts. And they're black boxes in the sense that nobody really understands the relation, the exact relation between the training data, the prompt, and the output. People can figure it out empirically. You can say a prompt and see what the system does. People have also found out that if you say the same prompt a day later, or maybe an hour later, or even a minute later, you might get a different answer the second time that you ask the question. So um, we don't really understand their internal operation. We know a recipe for how to build them, but we can't do simple math on them the way that we could do with, for example, what we call a multiple regression model, where we would know exactly why something happens. So if you use a multiple regression model and somebody doesn't get a loan, you can say these are the factors that went into the decision about whether or not to give you a loan. And if this one had been different, then this might have happened, and so forth. We can't do that with large language models. This is, in my mind, a very serious issue. So you might look at the blueprint Bill of Rights that the White House put out, for example, and it demands that models be interpretable. There's every reason to think that we should want that. But the reality is we're not getting that from this technology. And some people are like, well, I don't care. They're fun, or they help programmers program faster. And others of us are like, well, if they're not interpretable, that poses risks. They might, for example, be biased. We can't engineer very well around them because we don't know what they'll do from one minute to the next. We can't build guarantees around them the way that we do in software in an airplane. They're kind of almost like the Wild West, and some of us are worried about that.
Thank you. You mentioned it just a few moments ago, but again, another one of these issues relating to trust is these systems' production of falsehoods, but stated with conviction. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, these systems absolutely are prone to saying things in a very authoritative way which aren't true. For example, every time somebody sends a biography from one of these systems of me, some of it's not true. One of them said that I like to get inspiration from my pet chicken, Henrietta. Only thing is, I don't have a pet chicken named Henrietta or anything named Henrietta. It just made it up and it said it in the same authoritative voice as it said other things like, I don't know, that I'm an influential cognitive psychologist or whatever. So that means that it blends together truth. These are basically generating machines. It gets mixed together so finely, to quote Doug Hofstadter in different contexts, that we don't know what's going to come out of them. Everything looks like it's truth, and a lot of it isn't.
Thank you. What about the issue of these systems generating text that constitutes sort of dangerous suggestions for people?
So a lot of things can go wrong. First of all, because these systems are blind both to truth and human values, they can easily be coerced to saying things that aren't true, that aren't consistent with human values. They can be coerced into making all kinds of really bad hate speech. In the brand new paper I just read about how far that can go. They can be coerced into creating lies on essentially any topic. So we know that state actors sometimes like to make propaganda. These systems make that job much easier. They're going to increase the amount of propaganda. They're going to distort elections. They're also going to be used to manipulate markets. So the ability of them to create profound amounts of is really enormous, and it's a little bit disconcerting. And because they aren't grounded in truth and aren't grounded in human values, they can be easily abused to do all that kind of thing.
Thank you. Um, is there anything you'd like to expand on why these systems are able to generate such bigoted language?
The reason they're so good at generating things like toxic language, even when they have guardrails in place, which can typically be easily broken, is because they see a lot of it. So they take stuff that's on Reddit, for example, in their training set. And some of what's on Reddit is kind of nasty. And these systems don't know what's good content, what's bad content. They're not grounded in the world. So they can be induced with the right kind of magic incantations to say really mean stuff. You can also induce them to say nicer stuff. It's not a guarantee in any particular circumstance what you're going to get. But to someone who wants to abuse the models, it's really not very hard because they are trained on all kinds of really toxic stuff.
What sort of issues around privacy and security are there with respect to these systems?
Something that is a little hard to grasp intuitively is that these systems don't work like databases. So, databases, you can build pretty strict security around what information they have, who has access to it, and so forth. These systems are not databases. They're more like almost like giant bags of stuff, and a lot of stuff is thrown in. The system does something like compression that makes some of it a little bit less crisp. And then you pull stuff out, and there's not a lot of control over what you pull out. And so, for example, sometimes people have shown experimentally that you can get private data out of them that nobody would want to have shared. The systems aren't very good at restricting that kind of thing.
Um, and what about the issues around trust and the organizations that make and deploy these technologies?
Because these systems depend on an enormous amount of data, and because they're making some money and getting people very interested, the people that run these companies have a lot of power. And I think it's an open question how they're going to use that power. And I would suggest maybe we shouldn't trust them. I think if we look at the history of how Meta has treated people's data, there have been many issues over the years. There's currently litigation underway regarding what they've done, for example, with children. So we have to ask, what are the values of the people who are collecting this data? If we look at generative AI, it's another example. People seem to be scraping the web and maybe even like buying movies or things like that. We don't really know what they're doing, but they're using a lot of copyrighted material that may well not be licensed. If you're an artist, you should be worried about this. If these systems train on your data, they're not interpretable. They might actually, even by accident, replicate some of your work. That's not great. Artists, film studios, and so forth need to worry about that. The New York Times has sued OpenAI, arguing that OpenAI is essentially plagiarizing some of their work without license. So there's a lot of questions about where the data is coming from. Is it being used appropriately? And ultimately, who's going to be affected by it all?
Great. Um, how important do you think, all of these issues, if we put them under the umbrella of issues about trust, how important do you think they are for the future of this technology and of chatbots?
Ultimately, for me, a lot of AI comes down to a question of trust. I think eventually we'll be able to build AI that we can trust. But the tools that we have right now are not very trustworthy. They can leak data, they say things that aren't true, they can be abused. The safeguards around the current technology just aren't great, frankly speaking. And there are a lot of questions around trust. There are trust issues that come up if companies use these things. Are their private data going to be revealed? There are issues if you as an individual use these systems. What happens to the stuff that you type into it? How can that be used maybe for deeply personalized advertising or even personalized misinformation? So a lot of questions right now around trust that I think don't yet have adequate answers.
Thank you. Um, Switching gears a little bit, what most excites you about chatbots and this technology as it moves into the future?
So, what I'm most excited about is not chatbots per se, but the possibility that AI will really help science. We're already seeing a little bit of that. I think we could see a lot more. You think, for example, about neuroscience, we've gotten almost nowhere in solving Alzheimer's, not made a whole lot of progress with depression, um, autism, and so forth. There are many issues that we would like to be able to address much better than we can with any kind of current medical technology. In the long run, I think AI will be able to help us with scientific discovery to help us figure out problems that are too hard for any one individual human mind to wrap their head around. And the reason for that, in part, is because the brain has something like, I don't know, 15,000 different proteins expressed in it in very complicated ways, building all kinds of complicated machinery. I just don't think individual humans can really understand that. So if you took a machine that had the causal understanding that a good scientist has that we don't yet know how to replicate, and combine that with the pure computing power that today's modern computers have, that could be an amazing tool. And I think we will get there. I just don't know if it's going to be next year, or 5 years from now, or a decade, or 3 decades.
Great. Um, there are some. Oh, why are some people talking about apocalypse and human extinction in connection to chatbots and artificial intelligence, while others are talking about a kind of utopia in our future? Um, why are these kind of these very dramatic conversations going on, and what do you think of them?
So we have these huge conversations in our field right now. Some people are what we call doomers. It's not a nice term, but people who think that a whole species might go extinct because of something that AI does. And we have kind of utopian people who think we should press the gas pedal and go faster and faster. I'm somewhere in between. I don't really think that the human species is going to go extinct anytime soon. I do think there's some value in this technology, but I also think the technology that we have right now is not reliable, and it's a little too early to press the gas pedal. I think we want ultimately to make sure that we land in a positive vision of AI that really helps humanity thrive. And we're maybe not yet ready to build that. And if we rush what we have now, it does cause a lot of problems around misinformation and cybercrime and so forth. And so I don't think we should press the gas pedal until we understand how the engine works and how we have crash protections in the vehicle and so forth. It's like we've got an early car. I'm not sure we should be making a billion of them and tossing them on the roads. I think we should do a little bit more research before we rush things.
Do you think in this sort of conversation in the field today that most people are worried about the right things?
I think there are a lot of different people thinking about AI right now, and some of them have good intentions, and some of them are, driven by vested interests and money and so forth. It kind of, it takes all kinds, and different people have different technical skills or philosophical skills. To get to the right place, we're really going to need a lot of people to work together. That hasn't always been the case, to be honest. I think AI right now is a kind of insular field run mostly by mathematically gifted people who don't understand some of the ethical issues. Um, but not everybody is like that. We need a culture change, I think, where people listen to each other more. It's not unique to AI, but it's very important in AI.
Great. And conversely, do you think people are hopeful about the right things?
I think the thing that makes me most optimistic is that a lot of people outside of the field of AI with backgrounds in other disciplines are recognizing that they can help. And I think in the long run, the more people we have thinking about our future with AI, the better. And this is really going to change our lives. And so we should have all hands on deck. And we're starting to have more hands on deck. And that's a good thing.
You addressed this a little bit, but previously, but I'd like to maybe address it head on. And the question is that some experts, yourself included, think that today's chatbots have strong limitations and that we need to explore alternative approaches to artificial intelligence. Could you explain for the general public visitor kind of why you think we need to explore these alternatives?
If you ask me, I think AI is in a kind of a rut. Almost everybody is working on the same thing. It's something called a large language model that was invented in 2017. And it's valuable. For example, it's helping computer programmers program faster. But it has its limits too. So, for example, these systems, as we all know now, hallucinate and make stuff up all the time. They're not particularly truthful, they're not particularly ethical. We need probably to think about other approaches to technology. Like if you thought about tools, it's like we've invented a power screwdriver, but you don't build a house with a power screwdriver alone. We need to develop some other tools. And unfortunately, the way the economics of the field work is like everybody's putting all their money into power screwdrivers. And so it's really hard to develop any other tools right now. When the power screwdriver people have, hundreds of billions of dollars and everybody else has like $1 million and they just can't really compete. People are like, well, we built our house, better and faster with a power screwdriver. It's kind of true, but like the houses are rickety and there's probably some kind of better house we could all build if we could all work together.
Thank you. Um, Many commentators see the future of chatbots and artificial intelligence as part of sort of a dire power struggle between China and the United States. What do you think about that kind of discourse?
So a lot of people are worried, will China get to GPT-5, let's say, before America? I don't know if that matters that much. In the short term, I don't think anybody really has a great technology for AI. I think a lot of people have a good one with a lot of flaws. Um, if China got GPT-5 before the US did, then maybe they could, for example, write a lot of boilerplate text faster than we could. But I don't know if that really would change the world. I think the imagination is if China got to GPT-5 first, they would like invent interstellar travel before us and it would like be a total game changer. That's not realistic. It could be in the long term that whoever gets to artificial general intelligence, what we call AGI, first might actually have an advantage if there's big enough distance in time. I just don't think anybody's actually close to artificial general intelligence that's really as reliable and sensible as the Star Trek computer, as opposed to kind of dodgy like what we have right now. And so it is, I think, important for countries to invest in AI, but I don't think we're at this like critical moment in the AI race that a lot of people think that we are. I think it's still, the first couple of laps, and we have a long way to go.
Um, I've heard this quip that when you hear AI, look for the people. Um, do you think that's kind of true of today's chatbots? And if so, how is that true?
Today's AI very heavily leverages data generated by humans. It wouldn't exist at all or wouldn't be useful at all without a lot of data collected by humans. That's been true for several years. Translation programs, for example, rely on humans having done a bunch of translations. They don't just figure out for themselves, what does this mean? What does that mean? How do they say it in different languages? Um, Everything right now is dependent on a lot of cheap labor, labeling data and correcting things and so forth. So humans are really important in the background. Then you have things like driverless cars where there may be a lot of people off stage in remote operation centers kind of bailing the cars out when they're stuck and so forth. So there are a lot of humans behind the scenes in many of the things that go on. That's not a logical necessity. You could imagine that a system could get very smart just by reading Wikipedia, which is also humans, but without all of the kind of specific daily data addressing anything. You'd have a system. Also, you could imagine a robot that simply interacted with the world as a child does and learn things from those experiences. That's not what we have right now. You could imagine it. A robot that learned for itself by interacting with the world, wouldn't be by definition as dependent as current ones are on human data. One of the things that this raises, by the way, is are the humans who are generating the data that the systems are using being justly compensated for their work? And I think a lot of cases the answer is no.
You've mentioned it before, but there's this a lot of discussion about misinformation, disinformation, and large language models. What do you think is the most important thing for people to know about this issue?
The most important thing to know is that it is time to really bring out your thinking caps. Every time you see a video now, every time you read something, could be that a machine generated it. And could be, in fact, that somebody had a machine generate a lot of stuff to steep you in some bogus narrative. And so now more than ever before, we need our critical thinking skills as we're exposed to a lot of stuff that's probably nonsense.
Um, Creating chatbots and other AI systems and deploying them uses a lot of energy, a lot of natural resources like water, and the materials used to create electronic devices. Um, are you concerned about the environmental sustainability of these systems?
There's already a huge ecological cost to the current approach to AI. Current approach to AI is very greedy in terms of how much data it uses, how much energy it uses, how much water to cool these clusters of supercomputers. So we would like, ideally, to see an AI that is less energy intensive. Children, for example, don't require anywhere near as much energy, yet manage to learn a lot about the world. So I think it's logically possible. Unfortunately, the direction that we're headed is for the whole problem to get worse because right now people realize that these systems are fallible. And the way they're trying to address that is not by inventing new algorithms, it's by trying to get more data into bigger clusters of computers, which means more energy. So I think in the short term, things are going to get worse until there's some fundamental invention and things get better.
How do you see how these technologies are impacting journalism for good and for bad?
So these tools have some good consequences for journalism in principle, which is they could make it faster to write things, but they have a lot of problems right now, which is they make stuff up. What we found empirically is that people have done things like have AI write journalistic stories, and they invariably make mistakes, not necessarily every single time out of the gate, but they often make mistakes. And because the systems are so grammatical, people often miss those mistakes. And so untruths get through because they're insufficiently fact checked.
Um, do you think we can regulate these systems? And if so, how?
I think we need a lot of regulation because I think there are a lot of different risks that AI raises. There's no one magic solution. Maybe the single best thing that the United States could do, in my view, would be to have an AI agency, like a cabinet level agency, because there are so many different things and the facts on the ground are changing so fast. We can't expect that the Senate is going to be able to legislate each individual thing. Oh, this new model came out, we should change this parameter. You need to have an independent regulatory agency that is overseeing things and trying to take advantage of the good as well as to mitigate the downside risks. And that agency needs to look at things like misinformation, cybercrime, like voice cloning scams that have become very popular in the last few months. Um, they have to look at market manipulation, et cetera, et cetera. So there are many different things one of the things that agency could do, I think, is to look at new software, new AI, and say, well, what are the risks here? What are the benefits? Make an argument here, as you would need to do with a medicine, and say, this is what, or some surgical device, this is why the benefits for this outweigh the risks. Right now, the AI companies can outline those benefits and risks, but they're under no obligation to show that the benefits exceed the risk.
How important do you think critical voices are to the development of the field?
I think critical voices are critical. It's interesting. A lot of the people in power in AI don't really want to hear any criticism, but that's what's gotten us to where we are now. I think that to get to a better place in AI, you need to do the same thing you would do in any science, which is that there has to be a give and a take. There has to be a peer review process. Critics are essential, or skeptics are essential for understanding the limitations and figuring out when somebody might be stuck and where else to go, and so forth. The tendency of people to try to drown out other voices is really not helping anybody in the long term. It might in the short term. The louder people kind of win in the short term, but in the long term, you get stuck doing the wrong thing.
Thanks. What do you think we can learn from the history of chatbots and of artificial intelligence more broadly to help us navigate our present and our future?
I think the single biggest thing in the history of chatbots is we've learned that humans are easily fooled, and that's not necessarily a good thing. So, going back to 1965 and Eliza, some people were kind of convinced they were talking to an actual therapist when they weren't. And now we have kind of the same thing, but at a much more complicated level. We have people falling in love with systems that don't really care about them in return. And it might, for example, forget about a lot of stuff. The software might get updated. This has actually happened, and cause people to be upset. A lot of people take these chatbots very seriously and don't really understand that they are just machines, that they don't really love us back.
And I guess the last question I wanted to throw at you, Gary, was just in thinking about our visitors there to the museum, you know, if you had them walk away with learning one thing about chatbots and this technology, what do you think is most important for them to understand?
I would say we're in a really important moment in history, but what we do with that moment is equally critical. So we're at a kind of dress rehearsal for the future of AI, where we can see what AI would look like, but the AI we have is not really safe, trustworthy, secure. And we can either go down a path where we say, we don't care, there's enough money to be made, and let's just throw caution to the wind. Or we can say, hey, we want this stuff to work reliably before we let it pervade our lives. The decisions we make around that are going to affect our descendants for a long, long time.
Well, thank you so much.